Hi, and welcome to the Community Pulse. I'm Mary Thingvall.
And I'm Jason Hand.
Today we're going to be talking to Jono Bacon, community strategist and leader, and author of The Art of Community, which I had the privilege of promoting with him during my time at O'Reilly Media. So, Jono, you're referred to by some, as the grandfather of community.
Oh dear. Am I that old?
I don't know. Absolutely not. But what got you started in community? What got you excited about it and into it in the first place?
I actually weirdly remember it quite vividly. It was back in 1998. My brother came to stay with us, my older brother Simon, and he got me. He told me about Linux and installed Linux on my computer because I was complaining about Windows. And I used to work in a bookshop at the time. And I went and bought a book called Slackware Unleashed, and it came with a CD on the back with Linux on it. And he basically spent the whole evening, because it was a bit of a military operation getting this thing set up, and he got it all set up, and then basically he left the following day. So I got home from school the following day. I was 18, and there was a post-it note on the screen with a username and a password to log in, and I had no idea what to do. So I started reading this book called Slackware Unleashed, and the first chapter was about the community, about how open source, kind of how people around the world got together to build software, and they connected over the internet, and they shared code and things like that. And that notion of people collaborating together online and building and improving the thing that brought them together was just absolutely fascinating to me. And it really kind of switched on a fairly dimly lit light bulb, but a light bulb nonetheless. And from then onwards, I started kind of getting interested in getting to know the Linux community and getting to know the wider open source community and participating in some projects. And I just started getting more and more of a thirst for, like, how do we work effectively together as human beings to do real stuff? And I think that's how it started.
Cool.
Fantastic.
I was going to say, Jonah, before I was familiar with you, Mary and I had met a few times and had talked. We've got this Slack channel called the Evangelist Collective that we started a while ago. Feels like it's been about a year almost, I'd say, right, Mary? And we started, just sort of tossing back and forth some different ideas, and what are some different conferences that are coming up, and what are some different resources to begin looking into, how to build community and how to bring people together and have that same experience, much like what you were just explaining to us. And she's the one who brought to my attention The Art of Community, the book that you had written. So I'm curious to know, at what point did you decide that a book was important, and was it, something that you'd been sitting on for a long time, or what's the story behind the book?
Yeah, well, I'd written a couple of books before that. One called Linux Desktop Hacks, and another one on PHP. And as I was, community leadership was starting to become my profession. I did some of it at a company called Open Advantage, which was a UK government-funded organization that basically provided free consultancy, open source consultancy to people. But it was when I joined Canonical as the Ubuntu community manager, and I'd never heard the term community manager before. In fact, I think I may have been one of the first, or one of the very early community managers in the technology world, because I'd certainly never seen that job title before. And in my first year or so, well, couple of years, I never met anybody else who had the same kind of job title. So it provided like a stomping ground for me to learn really how do you build good communities, to make some good steps and some bad steps, and learn from the bad steps. And kind of a methodology was starting to pan out there. And it was about probably two or so years into working at Canonical when I started thinking, I feel like we're at the beginning of a brand new industry forming here, that there is value in people who can understand that interesting connective tissue between the people and the product, because it's, as anybody who's done this before knows, it's a really interesting amalgamation of collaboration, of trust, of privacy, of opportunity, and also of insecurity in some folks as well. So, I started kind of developing in my own mind what the good and bad methodology was. And then, like I said, a couple of years in, I started thinking, I want to do what I can to move this industry forward, because it was around, I'd say, 2007 or so, we were starting to see some people getting interested in community leadership, and some of those folks were, in my selfish mind, not doing what I consider to be the right thing. They were focusing more on going to conferences and waving their hands around on a stage, as opposed to actually solving difficult problems of how do you get people to collaborate more effectively together. So, my goal was, I want to, in this early stage of the game, I want to instill my thesis of how you do it, to start as to be kind of like a discussion point moving forward. And that's when, the relationship with O'Reilly already existed. I'd published Linux Dust to Packs through them, and I actually had a conversation with a guy called Andy Oram, who was my editor on the books, and I'd had this idea of a community book for a while, and in fact I talked to A-Press about it. I think it was first, but it was too niche of an audience. But at that time, O'Reilly felt like it would be worth doing a book on. So, so I went ahead and did that, and I wanted to make it very clear to the world, like, this is just my idea of how you do it. This is not the way you have to do it. This is not necessarily even the right way to do it. This is just one way of doing it. And it actually, for me, selfishly, it turned out to be one of my better career decisions, because so many people have read it and have got in touch with me and said, well, you talk about this, but I've also discovered this, and I've also discovered this, and you were full of crap about this, and it's really helped to facilitate a conversation, like I say, at a time when, back in those early days, when there really wasn't a lot of other people doing that kind of thing. And my wider goal was, I wanted to write a book, to set up a consultancy practice, and then to organize a conference. So the book came first. The consultancy came after the book. So I consulted with some companies like Deutsche Bank and Samsung and places like that. And then the Community Leadership Summit came after that.
Cool. Yeah, I once Mary had mentioned it to me, I immediately went and got the ebook off of Amazon and dove right in. It's
Thank you.
As you know, we spend a lot of time on planes, which is an opportunity to the podcasts, hopefully like this one, and
yeah, totally.
Break down books and stuff. But I believe I got the more recent version, and I know this original one had came out in 2012. What, if anything, really has changed much since that first edition?
So the first edition had, it was the big piece of work. It was writing a book from scratch. And what was really hard about writing the Art of Community was, again, as anyone who's done community leadership knows, there's not a linear path in teaching it. If you're talking about governance, for example, you need to know about conflict resolution, but to know about conflict resolution, you need to know about relationship management, and there's all of these different pieces that kind of fit together. So the hardest bit was actually, how do you present this spaghetti of information and techniques in a way that makes sense? And that was really the most difficult. That's where Andy Oram, I couldn't be more thankful to him for his guidance and leadership there. But the second edition was really the goal there was to expand it, to include stuff that I'd learned in the couple of years since the publication of the first edition. I really didn't go and change a lot of the original content. I went and changed some elements that I'd learned the folly of my ways. But then I also incorporated in the second edition a ton of interviews with various community leaders. So there's an interview with Linus Torvalds, who created Linux, Mike Shinoda, who's the co-founder of Linkin Park, the band, who do some really interesting stuff, Mike Linksvayer from the Creative Commons, Ilan Rabinovich from the so-called Linux Expo, and various other people. So it was really, the idea there was, yes, you've got this thesis that I've written about how to do it, but let's hear some interesting, thought-provoking stories from some other people to get people thinking in different ways. Because we really are, in my mind, in the very early stages of this industry, and we're still figuring out the, what's the best way to do these things.
Totally agreed.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that we're struggling a lot with is titles. What do we call ourselves? A lot of people say community manager. A lot of people say social media manager. A lot of people say those two are the same thing. Some of us disagree, but that's a whole other conversation. But I noticed you call yourself a community strategist. Why is that?
Well, I kind of interchange them really in a few different ways. So in my mind, a community strategist is someone who sits down and looks at the stakeholders and the community and what an organization wants to accomplish, and then puts in place a strategy. So they say, you know, this is what I tended to do when I was consulting. You know, I'd go to a company and say, what kind of community do you want to build, and what are your ultimate goals? And then you can sit down as a strategist and say, this is the infrastructure, this is the process, this is how we're going to manage all of this. Here's how you're going to get buy-in from the different people in the organization. Because invariably with a lot of companies, for example, the first foray into community, most people in the company are absolutely not bought into that. It's alien, it's weird, it feels like you're giving away control. And a lot of this is internal politicking in many cases. And I think a good strategist does that kind of stuff. To me, a community manager, or some people say a community leader, and some people say a community gardener, is the person who is actually going out there and doing the work of delivering that strategy and engaging with the community and building growth and delivering value. And then I think there's related pieces. Like some people use the term community manager to describe social media manager, and in my mind, it's, you know, my definition of community is more than social media. Social media is a tool and a component of it, but it's by no means the full essence of it. And there are awesome social media folks out there who do it. But to me, community is a much broader spectrum. But you know, part of the challenge here is that there's loads of different types of communities. You've got read communities, as I call them. You know, people who get together to share a common interest, to share a passion, such as Lord of the Rings or Taylor Swift or whatever it might be. You've got write communities where people collaborate together, different ball game. And now we're even seeing things such as crowdsourcing with Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you made a really important distinction that sometimes people do get confused, and that is that they believe a community manager is really just someone who brings people together socially online through the various social networks. And I think that's unfortunate because as much as actually a social media manager, I believe these days, is extremely important, mostly because they're sort of the internal PR and brand manager to a certain degree, and they sort of manage and just at least be aware of what's going on and what's being spoken about the company or about the brand, but then also make sure that message is put out there into the proper channels the way it needs to be done. So I think, the social media manager or social media role plays sort of a collaborative role with community, but certainly not the same thing at all.
Well, I think as well, there's a big distinct company. For example, I learned this to a significant extent when I went to X Prize. I went from and really building a community in an organization and in a culture where community was very natural and to a reasonable extent understood. Open source, it's very well understood. And then I went to X Prize, an organization where community really didn't exist. This was a brand new concept, a brand new premise, and rather unsurprisingly, in a lot of organizations, when something's new, people, if they don't have the information, they'll fill in the gaps themselves in their own heads, and that can freak people out. So, I think, community in the eyes of X Prize was social media, but community in the eyes of Canonical was the team that I ran. That was a really fundamental piece of how we built Ubuntu. So, I think this is why I think it's a very difficult thing to determine, is that just the articulation of the role is complex. It's like the concept of a programmer is well understood, but then the variation is in what they're programming and on what projects they're programming. Whereas the concept of a community leader or community manager varies massively across different industries, I think. So.
Yeah, you bring up something that kind of perfectly leads into my next question. First of all, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Community Leadership Summit, which I attended the first time this past summer, right before OzCon out in Portland. And one of the things that was talked about a number of times out there, and I may have been the one who brought it up, was I felt, I was there to learn about building a community, but a lot of the conversations that were being had were actually more focused on open source types of community. Right. And I think there's a lot of people out there who, when they hear community, that's what they associate it with. And for me, I come from VictorOps, and we're not an open source tool. That doesn't really apply to us, but I'm still trying to build some sort of a community, both internal, but also external as well. And a
Yeah.
lot of those conversations, they're just not really relevant to what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So the original goal of the Community Leadership Summit, and as you mentioned, it happens the weekend before OSCON each year. This year was our 7th year, I think we've done it. And next year it'll be in Austin instead of Portland because OSCON's moved over there. The original goal was really that across all professions, bring people together who are building communities in whatever way. It could be technology, it could be open source, it could be government, social activism, whatever it might be, and get those people together to share and learn best practice from each other. And in reality, that's actually kind of difficult, as you probably saw at CLS, because there is a basic level of commonality, I think, between any community leader around things such as methods of engagement, behavioral economic theory. This kind of like I forget the description. There's this notion of what is it? There's a book called Nudge that I've been reading, which is basically talks about choice architecture in a community is a journey, it's an experience, and you provide a set of choices, and you can architect those set of choices to develop certain outcomes. And this kind of fits in with the whole behavioral economics theory that a lot of people are very interested in. So those kind of components really can map to any community. But then outside of that, any level of detail, you start getting into specifics. And the Community Leadership Summit every year is predominantly dominated by open source folks, because it's before an open source conference rather than surprise.
Of course, makes perfect sense.
So I kind of gave up on that a little bit in the last couple of years, and just I've just accepted that CLS is more of a technology open source orientated conference. But there is definitely there's a lot of nuance in how things are applied, even the same principles, how they're applied in different areas. So for example, governance. In an open source setting, governance, there's many examples of it. We've seen community councils forming, we've seen it within Ubuntu, within Red Hat, Fedora, within Apache, places like that. There are, people are grandfathered in, you have, codified agreements for those different governance boards and all the rest of it. But governance within a non-open source project or an organization, for example, is quite different. We actually did this at XPRIZE. One of the goals of the leadership team at XPRIZE was to just build a greater level of engagement with the employees, and it's a relatively small organization. And one of the ideas that was proposed and that I played a role in was setting up a governance council for employees, and this is an internal thing. So a lot of the elements of how we operate that governance work quite differently to how you do it in open source. So yeah, the goal of the CLS really is to kind of my goal is that people can go there and they can learn something, and they can learn a series of things that will help them to think a little differently. And every year I go there and someone says something, someone drops something into conversation. It can be in a session or it can be over a drink in the evening, and it really gets your mind turning and considering new options and new ideas. And that's the primary goal.
So that kind of segues into a question that I had. Speaking of XPRIZE and switching out of open source, you had a article in IT World recently, an interview that was posted. And you talked a lot about read communities and write communities, and the idea of crowdsourcing and how those three things differ from each other. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So one thing I'm going to use this as a pedestal to make something clear. One thing that took me a little bit by surprise when I saw that article go online was it said Jono Bacon on leaving open source and going to XPRIZE, and I just want to make it very clear to everyone, I'm not leaving open source. I've not left open sourse. Sorry, you don't get rid of me that easily.
You mean everything that's posted on the internet isn't true?
Right, because it hit Slashdot, and I got like I was just working one day, and just a bunch of private messages appeared, and people said, "Hang on, you've left open source?" It's like, what are you talking about? Went to Slashdot, and there it was on the front page. So I dropped Slashdot a message and said, is there any chance you could clarify the title? So it's a great question, though. I think there are again subtle differences between those different types of communities. Crowdsourcing, in some ways, I don't really consider much of a community, because Uber's the classic example, because invariably those the people who are the inventory in Uber, they don't really get together as a community. You could arguably do that. You could have a forum for Uber drivers, for example, where they could trade horror stories of the general public. But it's not really a community. It's inventory, and it's a really interesting way of using people to populate a service. And we're seeing that across the board. We're seeing it with doctors and Airbnb and stuff like that. The primary difference in my mind between read and write and the opportunity within both of them is that read communities are really about people meeting like-minded people. It's people getting together and having a sense of unity, of kindred spirits. And one of the things that I think we've learned as people is we're animals, and as animals we're social. We're inherently social, and we enjoy spending time with like-minded people. That's the reason why bars are so popular, is that people like to go and hang out with their friends and be social and talk about the world and what Donald Trump said last week. So the goal of a read community is really just getting those folks together. Whereas with write communities, it adds that whole project leadership and collaboration piece in there. And that becomes a lot more complicated, because invariably, if you've got a company behind a community, you've got this awkward balance of a company that's building a product, a community that's playing a role in building that product and consuming that product, and the information flow and the content flow between those two different entities. And it's hard enough just to keep, we all know it, with every company there are communication challenges. It's hard enough within a company, within the walls of a company, let alone when you add an external element to this. And one of the major benefits of communities, and Dan Ariely made a point of this when he wrote Predictably Irrational, is it's about building trust. Is that when you have a community and it's out in the open, and you do your business out in the open, it provides unequivocal accountability. So you can see what that company does and how it engages. And that's one of the reasons why I think open source has been so successful. So the write element of things is a lot more complicated than the read piece. And I think we spend a lot of our time in the open source world focusing on that write piece, but there's a lot of complexity goes into the read piece as well.
Well, and I think part of the complexity that goes into the write piece is the idea of, as soon as you open up the communication flow and allow people to talk back to you,
Right.
you can get people talking back to you and dealing with, disrespectful comments, or, I don't approve of the changes you made and things like that. I know you have a book and a video along that topic as well. Talk to us about how that came about.
Yeah, so I wrote this book called Dealing with Disrespect, and I did a presentation that I presented on it at OSCON one year and recorded a kind of a video to put online as well. It goes back many years, a frustration that I'd had, where there was many people over the years, good friends of mine who I've met in various communities, who got out of various open source communities or collaborative communities because they do something. They take time away from their friends and their family to make something and to share it, whether it's a song, a video, a piece of software, whatever else. And then they get attacked. They'd have cynical people attacking them for their work, for their choices, or for their looks, or whatever else. And they'd think, you know what, screw this. I'm not gonna spend my time making something only for it to be crapped upon, frankly. And in my time at Canonical, one of the things I learned there was Canonical made a series of controversial decisions from time to time. And so I was, as one of the public representatives of the project, I was put in the crosshairs quite a few times. And one of the things I learned from those experiences was the optimal situation, I think, for anyone in a public position is to learn from the feedback and the critique, and to ignore the trolling. And I think it's difficult for people to do that. Through practice, rightly or wrongly, I learned kind of how to some people describe it as growing a thick skin. To me, it's more than that. Growing a thick skin is about deflecting things you don't like. To me, this was about was about really pulling out the value in the discussion, and then also learning more about the person you're conversing with. So I'll give you an example. There was a time. I will anonymize who the person was, but there was a person some years back. I can't even remember what it was, but we did something, and this guy basically, who was usually pretty cool, a little critical from time to time, basically just sent me an email and just absolutely laid into me. Was attacking me about my decisions, he was even attacking me for like my accent. I just moved to the US and all this kind of stuff. And when I read that email, what was evident to me was he was stressed. Like, this was not his normal persona. When I read into the words, I saw there was an insecurity that was playing a role there. He was stressed, and it told me that there's something going on outside of his life. So I got on the phone with him. We had a chat, and it turned out that his wife had just left him, and he was in just a bad state in life. And one of the things that I learned over the years was, when you see this kind of critique, when you see this kind of feedback, you don't know what somebody else's bad day is. You don't know, somebody maybe having health problems, maybe having family problems, and it's all too easy for us to just look at the words. So, when I remember thinking to myself, I want to help people who are in this position where they experience this kind of conduct, and they get frustrated and they get exacerbated and they don't know what to do. So I basically started thinking, talked with a bunch of folks who I know and trust, and I wanted to come up with a framework that people could use to kind of process this kind of material, whether it's awful YouTube comments or whether it's blog comments or whatever it might be, to be able to take this kind of stuff and put it into context. And that's what the book basically is. And my goal really was write a short book that you can read in a couple of hours, and it will just give you a tool that you can use to process this kind of stuff. And I think it can also be useful, for example, within organizations where, I've worked with many people in the past where they're in a meeting where someone's critical of the work that they do, and they completely overreact, they blow up, or they get depressed, and they don't handle it in what we would consider a particularly professional way. And I think the book can be useful also for helping people to manage those kinds of situations, because a big chunk of this, I think, is looking at yourself from the outside in and saying, what's the best way for me to react to this situation, as opposed to just emotionally reacting to that situation.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of important for especially a lot of community leaders to consider, because we are the ones who perhaps have to engage with trolls, or at least deal with someone who's got something to say that it seems like they just want to come in and rattle some cages. They're not really providing anything useful to a conversation. And I know, at least for myself, I'm a creative person, and most of anything that I put out, for others to view, this podcast included, if someone has anything negative to say about it, I'm going to take that, as much as I try to avoid taking things personal, it is sort of your baby, it is your project, you put some time into it, and it's hurtful to hear those types of comments made.
Yeah, no, I think that part of the challenge here is that people conflate. I think people conflate reasonable critique and trolling. So, I think there are times when somebody is remarkably critical about something, and they can be very pointed in the way that they present that criticism, and that's perfectly fine. That's not necessarily trolling.
Sure.
But then there are times when people conflate trolling with, feedback. And to me, if you're an asshole and you're providing feedback, you're still an asshole. And we need to get that in check.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. Really looking forward to taking time to check that out. One of the things that you had mentioned, just kind of leading into that conversation, was that as we were talking about the things we create and the things that we do, we spend a lot of our own personal time investing into these things, and that's time away from our family, and that's time away from our friends, that's time away from our hobbies, it's time, just kind of being offline and readjusting to ourselves. And I think in a lot of cases, this role, or the roles that fall under the community leadership type of stuff, require a lot of travel. Even in today's day and age, with things like Google Hangouts and Skype, and the ability to instantly communicate with people around the world, there's something that you just can't replace when you're with someone face to face and having those engagements. So I know you're married, you've got a young one. Talk a little bit about the travel aspect of this type of role and how you've been able to sort of deal with that. Maybe advice for others.
Yeah, it's always difficult, and the travel definitely plays an important role, I think, in the job, because as you mentioned, the travel is invariably where you build and foster relationships. It's where you get together with people. And there is, as you said, there is just such tremendous value in face-to-face relationships. And I don't think that's just sitting across a meeting table. I think that is going to dinner together. It's having a drink together in a bar. It's all of those different elements. It's developing social cohesion with people. It's really, 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 really important. And I think it's also where community leaders build legitimacy as well. I think it's important for all of us to be able to demonstrate the value that we bring to any community and any organization. And having people experience you working is a good thing. We can do that, I think, better in many cases face to face. It definitely has. It's like anything in my mind. It's balance. Like whenever I travel. If I have to travel, I like to make sure that there is at least like a week when I'm at home, where I can spend some time. I don't like to be away too much, but I also need to travel sometimes. So, for example, when I travel, I try to avoid traveling at weekends. I'm with my family. If I have to be away for a week, I try to leave some time between trips. And sometimes it's unavoidable. I mean, like my wife is away right now, and I leave before she gets back. It's difficult from time to time, and then I think you can obviously mitigate this with having a hangout. Like I have a hangout with my son all the time, so we can catch up and and all that kind of stuff. But it is one of the things I learned later in my career was just the importance of that face-to-face stuff. I used to be of the opinion that getting people together face-to-face for sprints or events or meetings was a nice to have in a lot of communities, and I was wrong to think that. It's not a nice to have, it's a critical to have. It's absolutely essential, and it's difficult to justify that to companies because it's expensive. I mean, when we used to get people together for the Ubuntu Developer Summit, it was incredibly expensive to pull 400 people together for a week, and all the airfare and hotel accommodation and per diem fees and all that kind of stuff. So, but it was really important, and particularly in building trust and also regaining trust when you have, complexity in communities. You cannot beat face-to-face communication, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I get to a lot of events, and Mary, I'm sure you've got some comments on this too, but most of the best engagements or interactions I have with people are in the hall. They're as we're crossing paths, going to different speakers, or kind of like at the Community Leadership Summit with the open spaces. I mean, I get so much more out of those types of conversations than I do, sitting in an auditorium listening to somebody talk. You get a lot of good stuff there too, but it's the relationship building stuff that you just can't do as well. It's not that it's impossible to do it, over Google Hangouts and whatever, but exactly. And I knew that going into this job, it's at least 50% travel, and that's a little bit daunting and can put a strain on relationships and health. And as Mary can attest to, like, you need some real serious time off after going and doing these things for a while. It can actually have a physical negative effect on you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people can suffer burnout from that. It's my view has always been, when you want to travel, traveling is so much fun and it's great. But when you don't want to travel, and there was times in my career when I really didn't want to be away. Like my first year at Canonical, I was on the road all the time, and I enjoyed it. I loved it. I was, towards the end of that period, I was I was starting to feel the burn a little bit. And when you don't want to travel and you have to sit in that aeroplane for a 15-hour trip to go somewhere you don't particularly want to go, it really
It's
sucked.
draining.
So,
But I do agree with the face-to-face communication. I mean, there's times when that can even solve the problems that you're trying to solve, period. Like
right.
we were talking earlier about, dealing with comments from people and not understanding how it was intended or what their message truly was supposed to be. And sometimes you just need to be in the same place.
Yeah,
And so that
exactly.
definitely needs to be taken into consideration. But also the balance is huge.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Well, I think we're almost about ready to wrap up. Do you have any resources that you'd recommend for people who are building a community or growing one of theirs, or strategizing about how to get that started in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think if people are, wanting to get into this, a couple of thoughts and resources. The first thing I'd recommend is just get to know some people who you can ask questions to. And I'm always happy to answer people's questions. People can email me at jono@jonobacon.org. But having somebody who you can kind of bounce ideas off, because it can be a bit daunting at first. So find some good communities to kind of join and participate in. I think the other thing is just observational skills, just like watch communities, watch what people do, learn from their work is a good thing to do as well. In terms of resources, I mean, obviously I'd recommend the Art of Community. You can go and download it if you can't afford to buy it. You can go and get it from the website. There's a PDF on there. And the communityleadershipforum.com is a community of community managers. And then if you can get to the Community Leadership Summit, we'd love to see you. And that's a free event to get to as well. It's going to be in Austin next year. And then a couple of other things books that I've been reading recently that I think are interesting that I'd recommend. I mentioned Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. Fascinating introduction to behavioral economics, which is really interesting. I'd take a look at Dr. David Rock's SCARF paper, which are 5 components that are prevalent in how human beings like to engage with other human beings. There's a great book called The Spider and the Starfish, which is about the switch from centralized management to decentralized management and the mixture of that. Like YouTube tend to manage themselves that way, for example. That's a great book. I mentioned Nudge. I just started reading this book recently, which is just fantastic. I'd take a look at that. And then I'd just also say that I think great community leaders are people who really are members of the communities that they want to build. Just a big chunk of it is not just about building a great community. It's about understanding your demographic. If you have never done anything with cloud computing and you go for a job as a cloud computing community manager, you got some learning to do. And because you need to, people who want to build process and they don't understand the needs of the people that they're building process for are bureaucrats. And you don't want to be a bureaucrat, and it's very easy to be perceived as a bureaucrat if you are trying to foist process and convention onto people who really want to work a different way. So I just encourage people to really understand the role of the person that you're building the community for. I think that's about it.
Cool. Well, those are all great tips and great advice, and we'll be sure to add not only some of those resources that you shared with us, but some of the other things that you've been working on as far as like the Community Leadership Forum and that kind of stuff, and Community Leadership Summit.
Awesome.
We're sharing all that on our site, and we should probably be wrapping up here soon. This time has just flown by, so I feel like we already need to schedule to have you back on the show again real soon.
I'd love to. Yeah, happy to help, and thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, this has been great. We've got all kinds of topics that we want to hit. It's really tough to get to them in a short amount of time. But we thank you for being a part of this. This is our very first episode. We did sort of a meet the hosts episode already, but this one will be the first with a guest on it, and it's been a pleasure to have you a part of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So With that said, I guess, Mary, unless you've got anything else to add, we can go ahead and say goodbye. Thank you for tuning in to Community Pulse, and stay in touch with us. I'm Jason Hand on Twitter.
And I'm Mary_Grace on Twitter.
And be sure to check out communitypulse.io for more information about the upcoming episodes that we'll have and all kinds of great resources on there. And we will just see you next time.